Poker After Dark, 300-600 with a 600 ante, and we're joining the action 240 big blinds deep as Jungleman opens with ace queen of clubs from the low jack, and Brian Rast flats him on the button with pocket deuces. Now, before we begin, let's examine the model. Jungleman is opening about 19 or 20% of hands from the low jack, and it's likely he's opening suited 8x or better, king jack offsuit, ace 10 offsuit, and some of the weaker suited hands, and I've weighted some of the weaker hands for a little board coverage and randomization. In this game, Rast has been playing very tightly, but slightly more on the passive side pre-flop, so I've given him the following range, never quite giving him 100% weight to any combination to indicate that it's possible that Rast 3-bets a little bit of everything pre-flop, but mostly 3-bets stronger hands and some betted suitor connectors, as you imagine GTO would do. This flatting range is not GTO by any stretch, it's just an estimate of what I'd put Rast on given the 300 to 400 hands I've seen from this video. It's possible many of these hands are 100% flats, that he's much looser pre-flop, but I've run this model with slightly wider ranges for both players, and at least in this hand, the strategies that GTO recommend using different ranges are actually pretty similar. There's usually only a few percentage differences in both actions and EV, as long as Rast doesn't really show up with 16 combos of top pair, top kicker, or all combinations of top set. I've given both players a variety of standard big and small sizings from street to street, though obviously all of these sizings can be additionally optimized with more overbet sizings on the turn and the river.
Damn, that was a real crazy hand.
Meanwhile, a monster flop for Jungle here,
Yeah,
up against bottom set.
Just played the way you're supposed to.
Uh-oh.
You'd win a wall.
Surprising no one, Jungle goes ahead and downbets this flop.
Swapping the rake back and forth.
And then Rast raises it a little bit more than 4 times Jungleman's bet. The flop comes queen 8-2 with 2 clubs, and let's take a quick look at range composition to give you an idea of how often Jungleman should bet the flop. So Jungle has 9 sets, maybe 2 combos of queen 8 suited, 12 over pairs, 36 top pairs, and about 22 flush draws out of 250 possible combos, so he has about 81 fairly high equity hands for about 32% of his range. Rast has 123 combos of total hands, 5.5 to 6 sets, 11.5 flush draws, a little bit of 2 pairs, 13 combos of top pair, so he's got about 31 high equity hands, so about 25% of his range. So with a slender proportional advantage of high equity hands, Jungle should usually polarize his strategy instead of going for a range bet. In this model, we can see that when given the option between betting 1/3 or 2/3 of the pot, Pio virtually always prefers the small bet with a polarized strategy, and if you compare the EV between bets and checks, you'll see that the EV between most actions is very close. On boards, when you have to polarize out of position, you can generally proceed with the following basic rules. 1, you should bet your stronger hands most of the time, but sometimes check them. You should check call your weaker hands with showdown values, but sometimes bet them. You should bet your hands with double backdoors, check fold when you completely whiff, but if you mess up the frequencies for any of these close hands, it's usually a pretty small mistake. The EV between betting and checking is often very, very close, and it's possible other equilibria exist that guarantee effectively the same amount of EV with very slight differences in bet and check composition. You don't have to pull your hair out in these kind of scenarios trying to find the exact percentage of bets and checks because the mistakes are often going to be so small. Despite facing a 1/3 flop bet, Rast's raising range should be relatively small, though admittedly the EV of raising pocket 8s, jack 10 of clubs, and pocket deuces are pretty much identical to simply calling. GTO simply prefers calling on the flop in order to distribute its raises with sets across the turn and the river as well. So when Rast raises, it's certainly not a mistake, and as you can see from how widely Jungleman should call the flop raise, he's almost never folding, say, 9-8 of spades. There's certainly a lot of value to be had. This deep, Jungle can really only come over the top with pocket queens, pocket 8s, and very rarely should he 3-bet the flop with his combo draws and 8x type hands. With a hand as strong as Jungle's, where he blocks both top pair and many relevant bluffs, there's not too much practical value in 3-betting. He'll usually just get action from a set, but on some rare occasions he will get value from a worse club draw. So ace-queen of clubs is a majority call with a very occasional 3-bet on the flop. When Rast raises, his range is usually so strong that his EV skyrockets to 82% of the pot, but after Jungle calls with his very strong but slightly capped range, Rast's EV falls to about 53% of the pot. So in order to defend profitably, Jungleman needs to trim his range so that his EV is slightly worse than Rast's, which is a useful idea to think about when thinking how to compose your defense ranges against other players. You want to call so that your EVs are somewhat similar going into the turn.
Jungle just calls the
I
check
think we
raise.
could arrange a game somehow where we can have big bricks of cash
Oh boy.
and cowboy hats.
Golden nugget.
There's got to be a way that we can.
So Jungleman calls the raise, which is obviously going to be very standard. The turn comes the queen, giving Jungleman now top trips, top kicker, and he goes ahead and
And
leads.
then we'll all get robbed and killed.
No, we have guys with shotguns.
Oh, okay.
You bring the guys with the shotguns. I feel like you might know more of
I
that.
have that.
When we compare the hotness of turns, we can see that cards that bring in draws and backdoors, like clubs, diamonds, and 9x, are good for the flop raiser, and hands that improve made hands on the flop are good for the flop caller. On this turn, a king is also very good for jungle, which surprised me offhandedly, as I wouldn't think to have a donking range on a king turn over the table. But diving deeper into ranges, this makes sense. While Rast should rarely raise a king-high flush draw on the flop, jungle should always be calling with his king-high flush draws, king-8 suited, and king-queen. Queens and 8s on the turn also clearly improve the pre-flop caller significantly, as it's much more likely that there are queens in the flop caller's range than in the flop raiser's range, especially if Rast 3-bets or folds more of his ace-queen and queen-8 suited combinations pre-flop. So on these 4 turns that jungle can lead, if you give him the option between a 20% donk and a 40% donk, Pio almost always prefers 20%, so there's no real reason to test larger sizes. Recognizing that this 20% lead was optimal was pretty freaking impressive from Jungleman's shoes. That being said, ace-queen with the ace of clubs is actually usually a check because it blocks villain's best bluffs and suddenly pushes villain's range to be slightly more full house heavy. Of course, the EV between betting and checking again is negligible, but checking here when you have ace-queen with the ace of clubs is a smart way to systematically mix up your game.
You're probably going to break even at worst in the game, though.
Break even at worst.
Boys. Now, if you want to leave this place.
Rast not raising with the boat.
When jungle leads, Rast's very narrow range should mostly raise when he has strong trips, full houses, and some gut shots and some combo draws for balance. Jungle's donk calling range on the turn should theoretically include some 8x hands and worse, so Rast can definitely get value by fast playing 8s, 2s, and king-queen offsuit. I thought it was notable that the draws with very little showdown value, like Jack-9 suited or 7-5 of clubs, were mostly raises or folds, while draws that could possibly hit top pair and win at showdown, like King-10 of clubs or A7 of clubs, were more often just calls. This is a recurring theme with how to play draws throughout Piosolver. The more likely you can spike a pair and win at showdown, the more passively you should play your hands in bluff catch. When Rast flats with pocket deuces or queen 8 or pocket 8s, notice that this is not a big mistake. He'll simply have more opportunities to turn his hand into a river raise on safe rivers. This is a spot where you can likely mix up between turn and river raises with practically no sacrifice to your EV while increasing confusion in your opponent. Good to know. After Rast flats, his range is now much more capped than Jungle's, and his EV is only 77 compared to Jungle's 165. On most non-club rivers, I imagine Jungle will have more trips and boats, and Rast will have more busted draws. The river is where things get pretty crazy. The river comes an ace, Jungleman hits the second top boat versus Rast's bottom boat, and he goes ahead and bets 7,000 into 24,500, which Rast very quickly raises to a whopping 38,000, and then Jungleman goes all in for his remaining 120,000, leaving Rast in a pretty terrible situation. Looking at the hotness comparison again, low clubs that don't bring in full houses are great for Rast, but even high clubs are really good for Jungle, who apparently will have enough full houses by the river to not really be affected by clubs coming in. However, with such a dominating advantage over Rast's capped turn range, Jungle's bet size seems unusual. Usually, with a huge EV advantage, Pio will pick a much larger size, and indeed, when we look at Jungle's river betting strategy, Pio prefers only using the larger size. This makes a lot of sense. Jungle has more trips and boats by the river, the ace should only improve his pure nuts advantage, and the ace should also give Rast a lot of top pair hands that theoretically shouldn't be able to fold the river if Jungle is balanced. If Jungle bets large, Rast should fear the possibility of full houses and call with almost his entire continuing range, even flatting eights and deuces. If somehow he made it to the river with ace-queen, pocket aces, or queen-8 suited, these are easy shoves, but most trips and lower boats just call. On the river, facing Jungle's actual small bet, raising trips is actually better than raising bottom boat, which is counterintuitive at first, but pocket deuces really only blocks other combos of pocket deuces exactly, while holding a queen blocks an array of ace-queen and queen-8 suited. Piosolver clearly values blockers to full houses more than the absolute strength of your hand, which is another theme that comes up over and over through study. However, of the hands that should bet the river, ace-queen of clubs is not one of those hands. Neither is ace-queen with the ace of clubs. Because you block so many of your opponent's club draws, it's much more likely that by the river, your opponent has trips, lower full houses, or some busted draws, all of which will take shots at you when you check the river. Additionally, when you check, it's not terrible for Villain to go ahead and bet some of his aces that got to the river, so you're still going to get a little bit of value when you check those hands and they fold against you. So, Rast raises and Jungle shoves a lot of money. What should Rast call? Again, let's assume that Jungle actually can be balanced here with bluffs. In this very episode, he talks about taking a similar line as a bluff and getting snapped off by Scott Seaver. So even if Jungle can have an occasional bluff here, the depth of the shove, plus Jungle's pure nuts advantages with pocket aces, quad queens, and more combinations of ace-queen, make this an extremely difficult call with anything less than ace-queen or queen-8 suited yourself. If Rast has to pick a hand to hero with, king-queen offsuit seems to be better than pocket deuces, again, because king-queen offsuit blocks more of Jungle's shoving range than pocket deuces does. So, will Rast be able to find the fold with bottom boat?
Wow, this is gonna be. This is. If I'm wrong on this one, this is gonna look stupid. There you go. No Jungle. Don't do it, Jungle.
Definitely a good fold. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next week with more analysis. Good luck.